This is Tom Phillips, and this surveillance footage is one of the few rare glimpses of him breaking into a store with one of his missing children right beside him.
What?
Now, what began as a seemingly harmless family getaway would spiral into something far more
He was
mysterious,
using his children?
including 4 years of lies,
Well,
secrecy,
not really
survival, and ultimately death. All of which was sparked by basically nothing at all.
Man, this is
so,
weird, opening
what
a fucking
really happened
Pokemon
across
trading
this
card
long
box.
and grueling timeline? How did friends and family cope with the sudden disappearance of 3 innocent children? And how did Tom manage to keep them hidden for so many years?
Wow.
Welcome back to Coffee House Crime, folks. My name is
Hello.
Adrian, and today we're traveling to New Zealand to look at the infamous case of the Marokopa children. Now,
New
this one is a
Zealand.
rather unique story about a man who vanished
Look
into the
at-
wilderness
there's box
not
art
once
inside
but
the
twice,
box, you
taking
can
all
see.
3 of his children with him. What followed was one of the country's longest and most expensive manhunts in modern-day history, and involved strange sightings, break-ins, bush talk, and even a violent shootout. Alright, you're gonna need a strong coffee for this one today, folks, so please get comfortable,
All right, let's
subscribe if
see.
you haven't yet, and let's caffeinate while we investigate.
All right,
This is the
kinda-
case
You can
of the
only see like
Marokopa
half
children.
of it 'cause- I could do it this.
Kia ora, folks, and welcome to New Zealand. Today, we're traveling to the western coast of its northern island and to a place called Marokopa. By the way, I have to say that I absolutely love the names and words of the Maori. For example, you've got Mangoataki to the south, Taharoa to the north, and on the other side of the island, you've got
here.
Taumata Whakatangi Hanga
Spider.
Kuauau Tamatia Turipu
we
Kakapiki
got the
Moanga
dice.
Horono Kupukai Whenua Tana Tahu. Anyway, back to Marokopa. It's a tiny windswept settlement which is tucked away on New Zealand's rugged west coast. And with its wild black sand beaches, rolling farmlands, and the Marokopa Falls nearby, it's a place where nature rules and people are very few and far between. In fact,
and
the sheep
then I
outnumber
think
the
this
people here
comes
by
with
such a margin that the local council is considering letting the sheep vote. Of course, on the condition that they stop eating all of the ballot papers in the meantime. Life here moves slowly, with farming, fishing, and the occasional tourist making up most of the activity. In a way, its isolation kind of gives it an almost timeless quality. However, as sweet as that remoteness sounds,
so we got
it
the
does
pack.
indeed work both ways, and it's here that we meet the Phillips family. Now, Tom Phillips was a farm-raised father from Marokopa. Fewer than 100 people live here, and so the Phillips family had farmed that rugged land for several
back.
generations. At the time,
Nine
Tom
back.
was living with his parents on their farm alongside his 3 children, that being Jada, 8, Maverick,
it
7,
comes
and
with,
Ember,
like,
5. Unfortunately, his marriage with his
special,
wife, Catherine, also known as Kat, had long since broken down, meaning that the children had to split their time between their mother and their father's properties.
Magneton.
It wasn't too bad though, because Kat lived in the nearby town of Otorohanga, meaning that the kids
these
could go back and
paper-
forth quite regularly, but often would stay with their father on the farm.
what the-
They were homeschooled too, which meant that they were in relatively heavy isolation. Now, Tom was not your typical modern man. You see, he didn't have social media, rarely used his bank cards or bank accounts at all for that matter,
Yeah,
and
apparently
would spend
this
most
guy
of his free
was
time
just,
hunting,
right, he
camping, or
didn't-
homeschooling his
he
children.
didn't leave,
Now, to
like,
be
a
honest, that doesn't
very
sound like a bad
big
life at
digital
all.
footprint.
To many people, he seems to be independent, self-sufficient, and liked to live life
this
on his
comes
own
with
terms.
sleeves, that's
But on
right.
the other side, some people saw him as quite reclusive and stuck in his own
this comes
ways.
with
From what I
sleeves.
was able to find out about him online, he was a little bit paranoid towards the
open it?
police
Guess
and
what?
other people in
Let's see what this
society,
is
but
first.
otherwise was just your average bloke. He didn't seem to be like infatuated with any sort of mad conspiracy theories or anything either. He just basically liked to live independently. However, behind that quiet country lifestyle lay a very bitter dispute between Tom and his ex-wife Kat. You see, technically, Tom was losing custody over the children, and despite still having them at the time, he was becoming increasingly resentful towards his ex-wife. Approaching 2021, the arguments between the two became quite explosive, and they never saw eye to eye. And apparently, according to Kat, Tom wanted to teach her a lesson.
should
In
look up
fact,
the
she would even
packets.
go to court and tell them that apparently Tom didn't actually care about his children at all, and merely saw them as pawns in his game against her. Tom and Kat continued to argue throughout the next few weeks, and as things slowly escalated, so did the insults and threats towards one another.
Oh, it's a
Things really were
collector's
becoming
box to
uncomfortable
hold
for
everything.
everyone
Okay, I
involved.
see it.
And then,
It's
all of a
divided.
sudden, out of nowhere, Tom and the kids suddenly vanished. It started innocently enough. On September the 11th of 2021, Tom Phillips and his kids all decided to go camping. Now, they were all last seen at the family farm
That's
in
actually pretty
Maricopa.
nice. Basically,
However,
you can
by
use this
nightfall,
as
they
like
were
your
gone.
game.
At first, nobody panicked,
Yeah.
because they all said they were going camping, after all. However, 2 days later, Tom's Toyota Hilux was
Game
found abandoned a few
paraphernalia, yeah.
miles away on Kiritaheri Beach. When officers arrived, they found the car's keys tucked under the mat and all of the children's car seats still attached in the back. To the police, this looked extremely concerning. Not only was a man and his 3 children missing, but their car was now abandoned near busy tides. Full of worry, a massive search operation followed, and the authorities did not hold back. They used helicopters, jet skis, drones, and boats. And the locals would even enforce a rahui in the area, which basically means a ban on all fishing, just in case the ocean held any clues or answers. For 18 grueling long days, absolutely nothing showed up. Not a shoe, not a campfire, and not a single trace of the family. Of course, Catherine, being the mother of the family, was beyond distressed, and most people assumed the absolute worst, that Tom and the kids had been swallowed by the ocean. But then, on September the 30th, something miraculous happened. Tom and the kids just simply walked back into his parents' home, and apparently they acted completely oblivious to all that was going on too.
We have
Just a hey, how do you do? What's for dinner? Now, thankfully,
got
all
this
4 of them were
Rapidash.
happy and healthy, and according to their grandmother, the kids were as bouncy as ever. And when asked what the bloody hell happened, Tom replied with, "We went camping, just as I told you." Apparently, he just needed to clear his head and didn't understand what all the fuss was about. The police, however, were not happy at all, because this search operation had cost them literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Tom, well, he was charged with wasting police time. His family were absolutely furious too, especially Kat. The thing is, most of them forgave him over time, simply seeing him as this stressed out father who had made a reckless decision. Despite the leniency found in some people, Kat herself wasn't fooled, because to her, this wasn't just a camping trip, it was a test run, quite literally a rehearsal. And as things would turn out, she was right too. Not even 3 months later, Tom and the kids would vanish yet again. On December the 9th of 2021, just before Christmas, he disappeared from the family farm, taking Jada, Maverick, and Ember with him. However, this time, there was no truck abandoned on a beach, and no frantic search teams combing the area either. In fact, the police didn't even launch a search party actually. Old grudges aside, it turns out that Tom had told his mother and father that he was going bush for a few days, and at least at that moment in time, he still technically had shared access to the children. Now, it is true that he was soon going to lose custody after a long and arduous battle with Kat. And although this did seem as very suspicious, the authorities assumed that he would be back in a few days. But spoiler alert, he wasn't. When Tom skipped his court date over the wasted search party costs on January the 12th, the authorities' patience finally ran out. They immediately issued a warrant, and when that was ignored, they knew that something was up. Launching their second search operation for Tom, the authorities started small, and soon enough, they found his ute abandoned on Mangatoa Road. Searching the vehicle provided no clues, and a wider search of the area around it would unfortunately turn up nothing either. It appeared that Tom and his children had vanished into the wilderness yet again, and this time, there was no telling on how long this would be for. The wilderness around Maricopa isn't only remote, but it quite literally swallows people whole. Dense bushland stretches for miles, thick with ferns, tangled undergrowth, and gullies so deep that they seem to pull the light out of the air. Simply stepping off of the narrow gravel roads, and you're basically in a world where sound doesn't carry, and footprints can vanish within hours. If that isn't enough already, stepping along the coastline, you will find black sand beaches that are battered by relentless surf and caves that cut deep into the cliff line. Put quite bluntly, it is a brutal place to survive. However, for someone like Tom, who is experienced in both hunting and camping, survival here isn't that far-fetched. The land provides food, water, and endless cover. And being in rural King Country, where communities are both tight-knit and wary of outsiders and law enforcement, it is no surprise that he very likely had backup. So, for the next year and a bit, sightings were basically non-existent, except for one time, and no surprise, that was with his very own family. It was in February of 2022, and while under the cover of darkness, that Tom actually crept back to his family home for an hour. He had basically gone to the property to tell them that he and the children were doing fine. But of course, they would only report this to the police once he disappeared yet again. But where they were staying, or how, or why, or how long for, he never actually said. You see, he trusted his parents, but of course, wanted to be discreet, just in case. And yet again, this would be the last confirmed sighting for the next 12 months. As time dragged on, speculation swelled, because, quite obviously, many people began to wonder, how could a man and 3 children survive in the wilderness for so long? Quite naturally, some people began to fear the worst, while others heard down the grapevine that apparently Tom was receiving support from locals. Which, unfortunately, isn't a surprise either, because in a rural community like King Country, people do often close ranks, and as it turns out, Tom had a whole league of sympathizers. While all of this was going on, Kat and her own family grew frantic. By mid-2022, that being a few months after their disappearance, Kat made the decision to launch petitions and even TV appeals in an attempt to revive interest.
This
in
is
the
all
background,
energy.
and
Okay, cool.
probably due to their failure to find him, police began to float their own theories too, hypothesizing that perhaps Tom had maybe changed identities or even left the region with his children. And with no official reward offered, very likely because Tom had already cost the police enough money, it was basically up to Kat and her family to raise that money instead. However, as the months passed by, Tom and his children became more and more of a distant memory. For more than a year after February 2022, they basically remained as phantoms without any trace
I have to
whatsoever.
find all the energy
However,
cards.
by the year 2023, the pressures of raising 3 children through storms and winters was becoming more and more challenging. And it turns out that the only way for Tom and his children to survive was for them to lean into crime instead. And I have to say, it was in the most comical of ways. The first major incident happened in May of 2023, and in the quiet town of Te Kuiti. On May the 16th, 2 masked individuals stormed into an ANZ bank, with one of them being armed with a shotgun. No surprise, but they were there for the money, and they meant business too, because after firing a warning shot, it unfortunately injured an innocent bystander nearby. Moments later, the pair then escaped on a stolen motorbike with a large bag of cash. And apparently, they were having a few issues too, because some of the citizens who were watching noticed them fumble with the bag before then accidentally dropping a whole bunch of that cash on the street. Basically, it seemed like an almost cinematic heist for such a small town. And I think it was probably in that moment that Tom realized he was more of a Bear Grylls kind of person and not so much Bonnie and Clyde. During the police investigation, they realized that one of the robbers was indeed Tom Phillips, and the other, well, it turns out that it actually was one of his own children, likely being 9-year-old Maverick. It would also reveal something far more disturbing, that Tom was no longer just a desperate father hiding from the authorities, but he was also armed and willing to involve his own children in violent crime. Now, although the authorities didn't publicly link Tom to the Te Kuiti heist for quite a while, they did in fact know it was him. And then, only a few months later, in August of 2023, a flurry of sightings were reported to the police. Not of Tom skulking in the bushes, but in Bunnings, of all places. Now, for all of you not familiar with Australia's and New Zealand's hardware stores, Bunnings is basically our one dominant store here. From dog toys right the way through to power drills, they sell everything. And that even includes selling sausage sizzles every single Sunday,
Oh,
which, by the way,
it's their
are
hardware.
absolutely
Oh,
delicious.
what they do?
Anyway,
Hardware
police received
plus.
multiple
Oh, it's
phone
like
calls of
they
a
do
bearded
hardware
man
and
with
food.
3 children in a bunning
So
store
it's
in
like their
Hamilton,
general.
which can be found more than 60 miles away from Maricopa. Security cameras caught him in disguise, wearing a beanie, glasses, and a surgical mask. And although, sure, it was COVID attire at the time, keen eyes would still recognize the man beneath. They realized that Tom was driving a stolen Hilux ute, and receipts showed his shopping list including headlamps, gumboots, buckets, and even vegetable seedlings. Though it looks like he probably gave that Bunnings sausage sizzle a miss, tragically. Through this list, it became quite obvious that Tom was actually building an off-grid camp with a garden included. It was around 2 days later that police recovered the abandoned ute near Tianga. The message was clear, however. Tom and the children were still close, still moving, and still stealing to survive. It was only after the Bunnings sightings that officers decided to go public with all of the information they had. They released the surveillance images of a tall man pushing a cart around the warehouse, and urged anyone who spotted him to call 111. What followed was dozens of tips. In fact, in September alone, there were more than 14 reported sightings of him. But unfortunately, none of these tips could be verified, and the group always managed to slip away. The Waikato was Tom's backyard, and it looked like he knew every single escape route possible. By early September, the authorities formally charged him with aggravated robbery, aggravated wounding, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Tom was now officially a wanted armed criminal, and with a rifle slung across his shoulder over most sightings, it was clear that the danger was obvious. A couple of months later, in November of 2023, a surveillance camera caught 2 individuals breaking their way into a Supret in Pio Pio. Detectives would later confirm that Tom had stolen the bike from a farm earlier that night, before then trying to steal money and food from the store at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. The situation would slow down for a while after that until June of 2024. When police announced an $80,000 reward for any information that would lead to the return of Kat's children. And notably, they said nothing about Tom's arrest there, just the return of her children. The other thing to note here that I find quite interesting is that this reward came with immunity too. In other words, the police were trying to say, if you're helping Tom, just switch sides and not only will we reward you, but we won't charge you either. So, it was no surprise that Tom likely had a few locals helping him out, and the police, well, they wanted that support to stop. In fact, by now, some people even saw him as a local hero who was standing up against the law, and without any deaths under his belt, many people were actually quite happy to turn a blind eye. On the other side of the fence, Kat also stepped forward, and on June the 18th, 2024, that being Jada's 11th birthday, she stood before cameras and begged for her children to be returned. So let's play the video here.
Kia ora te ao, ko Kat taku ingoa, no Aotearoa hau. Hello world, my name is Kat. I am from Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. I am standing here before you today, begging you for your help to bring my babies home. They are just innocent children. They do not deserve to be treated this way. They do not deserve the life that is being provided to them right now. Today is Jada's birthday. She is 11. She will be a young woman now, and she needs her mother. Ember is asthmatic, as am I, and she needs medical care that cannot be provided from the land. And I can only imagine how Maverick is coping with the hand that life has dealt him. Many of you say that the children are fine, that they're being well looked after. How do you know? Have you seen them? Or is it just bush talk? What Thomas is doing is not okay. It is not okay to divide and conquer. It is not okay to isolate and control. It is child neglect, it is child endangerment, it is child abandonment, it is child abuse. None of this is okay. My babies deserve better. I'm just a mother standing here in front of the world, begging you all to help me bring my babies home. Please, if anybody has any information at all, ring the police.
Despite the reward and the public appeals, all tips would lead nowhere, and the trail once again eventually went cold. However, that would all change in October of 2024, when all of a sudden, a group of pig hunters out on their usual routine spotted Tom and his children only 2 miles south of Maricopa. This grainy footage showed Tom at the front, with Jada, Maverick and Ember trudging behind in single file. At one point, a child even called out, "Who knows we're here?" The hunters wisely kept their distance, but as soon as they were gone, they rushed this footage to the police. As soon as they became aware of this, officers launched a full-scale search operation with ground teams and helicopters.
Oh, yeah.
But unfortunately,
Well, I mean, once
Tom's knowledge of
you
the
saw
bush
them
would
and
win
found
yet
their
again,
trail.
and within days,
What
both
now?
he and the children had vanished once more. Now, obviously, this footage was bittersweet for Kat, who felt both gratitude and grief. I mean, at least she could tell that they were alive and well enough to walk, but she also called it exactly what it was: child abuse. As 2025 began, tension only grew. By the middle of the year, the children were now 12, 10 and 9, and it seems that the legend surrounding Tom was wearing thin. Even his own family begged him to give up and come home. In late August of 2025, Tom had yet again targeted the same soubrette and POPO. At dawn, a surveillance camera captured a man and his child breaking in with an angle grinder, before then fleeing on a quad bike
Wait,
with
what?
groceries in
Angle?
hand. It was the same store that he had targeted back in 2023, and this time the police were ready. The burglary was the last straw for officers. Surveillance tightened, patrols ramped up, and although the military was ruled out, the message was becoming quite clear towards Tom. The net was closing. And in September of 2025, a final robbery would initiate a chain of events that would finally bring this entire saga crashing down. In the early hours of September the 8th, an alarm was triggered at PGG Wrightson, a rural farm supply store in
You're stealing
POPO.
stuff.
The call came through at around 2:30 AM, and while the break-in was still underway, given the recent events, police already had an idea of who it might be. Officers raced to the scene, and sure enough, it was Tom Phillips and one of his children. Loading supplies onto a quad bike, they all of a sudden realized that their cover was blown and immediately sped into the darkness. However, this time, police units had already ringed the area. Officers deployed road spikes
they were
across all
already waiting.
rural roads leading out of the town, this including the junction along Tianga Road. Minutes later, the quad bike appeared, before then hitting the spikes and then grinding to a halt. Of course, Tom realized that he was now cornered, and sadly, he wasn't prepared to go down easily. Both desperate and
he went
armed,
out.
Tom opened fire at one of the officers he saw. The officer was struck multiple times with a high-powered rifle, with one shot hitting him in the head and the other his eye. Now, miraculously, although he was critically wounded, the officer managed to crawl for cover and then radio for help. Only a few moments later, a second unit arrived. However, this time, police officers were ready to give Tom everything they had back. The night erupted into a shootout, until, eventually, in the chaos, Tom was shot dead. And after nearly 4 years on the run, New Zealand's most wanted man was now finally seized. The scene was chaotic, and when the shooting stopped, police discovered multiple firearms near the quad bike and his body. It was clear that Tom had been preparing to fight, but thankfully, his child was unharmed. However, as for the other 2 children, well, they were still missing. And so, as soon as sunrise appeared, a massive search followed. The police believed
So
that
one
Tom had
child
very
was
likely
okay,
left
but
them
the
at a
other 2
nearby
was-
hideout while trying to steal food. And thankfully, the child that was now in custody was happy to help them out. And so, with this information at hand, they got to work in finding them. Later that afternoon, teams located Jada and her other brother at a makeshift campsite only 2 miles away from the shooting. And although both were alive, one was reportedly armed with a rifle standing guard. Negotiators who were dispatched to the scene eventually persuaded the child to put the weapon down, and then finally, at long last, all 3 children were pronounced safe. Investigators combed through the campsite, and they realized that actually they had been here for multiple months. They found crude shelters, charred fires, and scattered belongings.
For
And
months.
amongst all the scraps were signs of their former childhood too, which by now only seemed to be reminders of what had been stolen from them. As the news spread, the shootout stunned the community, and the mayor of Waitomo called it the worst possible ending. And now, Tom's family, who had pleaded for his return, were now left to mourn for a son who had lost his way. As for Kat, well, the emotions were mixed. She expressed relief that her children had all been found alive, but also, she didn't want to see Tom dead. As for the officer who took 2 bullets to the face, he was airlifted to Waikato Hospital and miraculously survived after multiple surgeries. Now, unfortunately, he did have multiple life-changing injuries, which included the loss of one of his eyes. But hey, I'm glad to hear that he made it. And so, after almost 4 years on the run, the mysterious case of the Marokopa children was now finally over. Not with surrender, but unfortunately with gunfire. And not with answers, but with grief instead. Now, you might be thinking, this surely is the end of the story, but in a way, it's only the beginning for Jada, Maverick, and Ember, because what happens to them now? For the last 4 years, these kids have lived in near total isolation, cut off from friends and family alike, and who knows what their father told them. And not only did they witness their father commit crimes, but they were made complicit at times too. And one of them even saw their father die. And now, all of a sudden, not only are they back in civilization with all of these rules and processes that they didn't have to follow for the last few years, but without a father, they have lost that compass that they'd been following too. There is no doubt that this is going to be a very challenging process for all 3 children. Of course, Kat will do everything that she can to help them heal. For now, the children are in the care of child specialists who will be assessing their physical, mental, and emotional health. The oldest, at 12, may remember what life was like before all of this, but the youngest, at 9, will barely recall anything. The priority will be giving all 3 of them a childhood again, free of fear. Now, one of the big questions around this case is how Tom managed to evade capture for so long. Part of the answer is obvious. He knew the land intimately. But, of course, the other concerning truth is that he probably had help too. Although the police never laid any charges, it is widely believed that locals quietly supplied food, gear, or even just silence towards Tom. Some people sympathized with him as a father who was merely just fighting for his kids.
Doing
In fact, a couple even framed it as defiance against the courts. However, the thing is, that loyalty towards Tom, however well-intentioned, absolutely prolonged the suffering that these 3 children endured. And here's another question, but what precisely was Tom's endgame? Now, some investigators believe that his first disappearance in 2021 was merely just a trial run. And then, when he realized that he was going to lose custody over his children, he basically felt forced into kidnapping them. Of course, gaslighting all 3 of them for the next 4 years in the process. Maybe he dreamed of eventually blending back into society with all 3 of his children under new identities. However, in a country as close-knit as New Zealand, that was absolutely fantasy. At its core, this all seemed to be around custody. And I don't think that Tom had a plan really either. I mean, firing at an officer as soon as you're caught is basically writing your own death sentence. I think Tom couldn't face losing his children to Kat, and so he took them away entirely instead. And although he never sought to hurt them physically, he did in fact deny them of school, friendships, safety, and even just a normal childhood. As the dust settles, questions surrounding accountability still remain strong. It is true that the police once offered amnesty to anyone helping Tom, but whether anyone will face any consequences in the future is still unclear. Now, obviously, the wilderness itself was probably Tom's greatest ally. He avoided phones, used cash, disguised himself in public, and moved camp frequently. It was the perfect storm of terrain, preparation, and silence. But in the end, modern society caught up with him. Whether you like it or not, Tom has already entered local folklore, who, at least for the next few decades, will be known as the outlaw bushman who outwitted police for nearly 4 entire years. However, unlike legend, this was not adventure. It was real life with real consequences, and sadly, most of that will now land on his children.
This has been a deeply traumatic incident this morning for those involved. It has been confronting and challenging in a small, rural, isolated location, and obviously this is devastating news for Tom Phillips' family as well, and is the outcome that nobody wanted.
And I think on that note, folks, we've come to the end of this story. A pretty bad outcome for Tom, but I'm just glad that his children are safe. However, how they reintegrate into society is still yet to be seen. Before I go, what are your thoughts on this case? Do you think that what Tom did was right? What do you think about his personality and behaviour? And what do you think will happen with the kids now? And did you like this story today? Let me know in the comments down below. By the way, this is just a very quick heads up, but I'll be announcing something next week, so keep your eyes peeled. And on that note, I'm going to stop the video here and probably make myself a coffee. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you very, very shortly for another one. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves, stay safe, and of course, stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.
Have it. That is Gals. Kind of like let us continue. All right, we got a OnlyFans 3 months.
This is Chelsea Perkins, a US Coast Guard veteran, better known as Selena Savage.
Coast
On
Guard
the
veteran.
surface, Chelsea seemed like a woman with an unusual path. A former service member turned mother and then eventually OnlyFans model. And whether you agree with her lifestyle or not, she knew exactly how to captivate an audience and how to hide
a
her
way of,
darkest secrets hidden in plain sight. However, behind that
Career.
carefully crafted image
Path.
lurked something that was far more sinister, including a festering obsession, a plan for revenge, and blood spilled on federal grounds. Unfortunately, that is where Matthew Dunmire enters the story. A man who was not only a beloved friend and father, but also someone who had his own shadowy past. Whatever lay between these two, and whatever messy history they shared, it would ultimately create a monster in Chelsea. And not only would her actions result in multiple deaths, but it would also force long-forgotten secrets right back into the spotlight. Hi there folks, my name is Adrian, and welcome back to Coffee House Crime. And today, do I have a story for you? This one has got everything your mother warned you about. A military veteran turned OnlyFans model, a secret revenge plot that had been brewing for years, and a murder in a national park. Oh, and also a Facebook post that basically gave the entire story away before it even happened. So top up your coffee, silence that phone, and maybe lock your front doors for good measure. On that note, please grab yourself a coffee, and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Selena Savage. Welcome to Ohio, folks. Today, we begin near the city of Hudson, and with a man named Matthew. Matthew Dunmire was, in many ways, your typical Ohio guy. At the age of 31, he was a free spirit, someone who loved music, played guitar, and cherished time with his friends. Originally from Virginia, those who knew Matthew described him as selfless, loyal to a fault, and always the first to lend a hand when someone needed help. Born on November the 26th, 1989, to his mother Tommy Lynn, Matthew was just a happy and cheerful boy. He was goofy, loved listening to Frank Zappa with his father, and found his guitar at a very young age. He also shared a deep bond with his circle of friends, most of whom were just as passionate about music as he was. And moving into his adulthood, with a long-term partner, 2 kids, and a solid crew he saw almost every day, well, Matthew seemed happily grounded in his small town just outside of Hudson, Ohio. Which is why, when he suddenly stopped responding to all text messages and didn't show up like he usually would, people knew that something was wrong. On the morning of March the 6th, 2021, Matthew disappeared under abnormal conditions. However, the real story began the evening before, on March the 5th. It was over drinks at the Tiki Underground, a local bar that he would often go to with his friends and co-workers, that Matthew said that he had plans for the weekend. He explained that a friend from Virginia was passing through Ohio, and so the two had decided to catch up. But rather than meet for dinner or coffee, they instead booked an Airbnb 40 miles north of Hudson, where they planned to spend the night together and then take a walk the following day. At around 6 p.m. that evening, and while still sharing a drink with friends, Matthew's phone lit up with a text message. He glanced down and then looked up and said to his friends that a so-called girl he knew online was here. That is when he stood up, grabbed his coat, and made his way outside. Wanting to be polite, his supervisor followed him, stepping outside to say goodbye for the weekend. The two exchanged a few words outside before then shaking hands. Meanwhile, his supervisor noticed a white smart car idling in the parking lot, its rear lights glowing in the dusky darkness. The car was for Matthew, and behind the wheel was a woman with brown hair. His supervisor couldn't make out much else, but Matthew did appear to be happy when he saw her. He then waved goodbye to his supervisor, got into the passenger seat, and then, just like that, the car pulled away, heading north along Akron-Cleveland Road and towards the big city. Now, at the time, it did seem like this was just another farewell. However, little did his supervisor know that he would be the last of Matthew's loved ones to ever see him alive. Although Matthew remained reachable that evening and even into the next morning, his messages would eventually stop. In fact, his final message was sent at 10:29 to his girlfriend, simply saying, "Okay, I'll see you in a little while." Wherever Matthew was at that moment in time, it is clear that he intended to return home later that day. But the thing is, he never did. He didn't reply, didn't call, and never came back. As the day wore on, his girlfriend, who, by the way, was already upset with him, grew concerned. I mean, Matt wasn't responding to any of her messages. But now, his friends were also saying that they couldn't get a hold of him either. And by the next day, well, that concern grew into fear. This was not like Matt at all. I mean, he had 2 kids at home after all, and all of those who knew him knew that he would not leave them hanging. Now, obviously, it is quite safe to say that his colleagues were already quite curious about this mysterious woman. I mean, it's not normal to go out of town with an old friend and then never return. And there were many questions onto why he was doing this in the first place. And now, his friends, they were openly alarmed. Who was she? And more urgently, what happened after she picked Matthew up? This mysterious woman's name was Chelsea Perkins, and it turns out that she was a high school friend of Matthew's back when he lived in Virginia. It's unclear how close the two of them were back then, but what we do know is that the two did in fact know each other, and their connection would prove to be pivotal only several years later. After graduating in the year 2009, Chelsea made a decisive move to enlist into the US Coast Guard. By the age of 19, she was stationed at Coast Guard Station Houston in Texas, where she worked as a small boat crew member and held the rank of seaman. Her military service was rather short-lived, however, lasting only 3 years until her departure in March of 2012. But it turns out that her time there would not be entirely fruitless, because while in the US Coast Guard, she met and then eventually fell in love with a fellow service member. The couple married a couple of years later, before then having 2 children and settling down in Northern Virginia. So far so good, and to the outside world, it seemed like a stable and respectable life. But behind closed doors and soon to be very public, Chelsea's lifestyle was transforming into something that no uniform could contain. And by no uniform, I mean quite literally no uniform, because Chelsea had made the decision to become an OnlyFans model. Now look, can I be really honest with you here for a minute, but do you know how hard it is to try and research an OnlyFans model without it getting a little bit risky? All I wanted was a bit of historical background and maybe a few pictures of her face. But Chelsea, she definitely had other ideas. So let's just say that now my eyeballs are in therapy and my search history needs a priest. To put this another way, after leaving the military, Chelsea did a full career pivot into the adult entertainment industry, rebranding herself as a porn model under the name Selena Savage. Now listen guys, I know you're curious, but don't go typing that name into Google. I'm serious and I'm watching you. Focusing on the more PG-friendly version of Chelsea, she still has an active Instagram account under the name of Selena Savage Official, where she would previously promote her content and other various life updates. From there, you can see that she likes motorbikes, hairless cats, and tattoos. And despite now operating in a very different world from the military, it does look like that she managed to leverage her online persona into a new source of income and attention. By early 2021, and at the same time that Matthew disappeared, she was a wife and a mother of 2 children, while online, she went by the name of Selena Savage. Friends and those who knew Chelsea described her as a very expressive person, who at times had somewhat of a bad behavioral reputation. A former classmate of hers from the Coast Guard described her as insane, while another former shipmate of hers described her as bizarre. However, it is important to note here that at the time, she had no recorded criminal incidents and no violent behavior on record before the year 2021. There is no known prior criminal history here, no arrests, no charges, and no civil lawsuits. It appears that after Matthew moved away from Virginia and to Ohio, he and Chelsea slowly drifted apart. Their connection, for whatever it once was, faded. That would be until a brief encounter in the year 2017. Now, we will get to the significance of that encounter soon, but for now, it's worth realizing that from that point onwards, they stopped speaking altogether. 4 years passed, and then in February of 2021, that changed yet again. During the icy stretch of that winter, Chelsea decided to add Matthew back on Facebook. It was a move that seemed casual and maybe even a little nostalgic. The two began to talk, and Chelsea mentioned to Matthew that she had plans to travel through Cleveland in only a few days' time. She told him that she was heading northwest of Detroit for a tattoo appointment, and since she would be in the area, well, they should catch up. Matthew agreed. I mean, sure, why not? It sounded simple enough. just two old acquaintances reconnecting for the weekend. But of course, that weekend would
haven't
be the
seen that
last
kind of
time that anyone ever saw him alive. While both friends and co-workers knew that he was meeting someone, either an old friend or a woman that he'd met online, nobody actually knew her name. There were no contact details to remember, and no ways to trace him or his friend. And so, when Matthew stopped responding, well, panic began to set in, and then he was officially reported as missing. But of course, with no leads and no trail to follow, nobody had any idea where he had gone. That would be until only 3 days later. At 11 AM on March the 9th, 2021, officers from the Valley View Police Department were dispatched to the Terra Vista Natural Study Area inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Hikers had stumbled upon a very gruesome discovery. Just off the trail and near an old cemetery, they found the body of a young adult male. The victim appeared to be dressed in all black, wearing fingerless gloves, a leather jacket, a hoodie, jeans, and boots. Lying beside him was a half-empty bottle of Aquafina, and inside his pocket, officers found his ID, which sadly would confirm that it was Matthew Dunmire. Although his body was then prepared for autopsy, it was already obvious what had killed him. Officers observed a single gunshot wound to the back of his head, therefore ruling that this was a homicide and likely not in self-defense. When his family and friends learned of the news, that grief was sure to hit hard, and the sadness rippled through his community. But no one took it harder than his mother, Tommy Lynn, who quite clearly was shattered more than anyone realized. And trust me, there is more to this story coming up. As the reality of his death started to sink in, attention quickly turned to that mysterious woman, the one that he had told everybody that he was with that weekend. Everyone who heard about her had the same burning questions. Who was she? Why was Matthew at the cemetery with her? And what happened between them? Now, at that point in time, nobody had the answers, but thankfully, the FBI were just about to get involved. And when they did, and eventually solved the case, let me tell you, they were surprised. But before we get there, let's first talk a little bit more about Chelsea, because it's not like an old friend would have a motive for murder, right? Well, sadly, wrong. In 2017, Chelsea went to the police with a very disturbing claim. She reported that Matthew had sexually assaulted her and that she wanted to press charges. Now, the details surrounding this allegation are still unclear to this day, but it does seem that the authorities investigated her claim and ultimately determined that there was not enough evidence to pursue charges, not even circumstantially. Not to say that it didn't happen, of course, but officers found nothing. Needless to say, Matthew denied the allegation, and not just in passing either, because those close to him say that he was utterly stunned, shaken, and horrified by the accusation. He claimed that it was entirely consensual, and that she must be lying for her own benefit. His friends were also shocked by the news. They described him as a gentle and laid-back man, the kind of guy who wouldn't hurt a fly. So, what really happened? The truth is that we don't know, and we never will. But what we can say is that moment clearly stuck with Chelsea. It lingered and festered, and those close to her would later say that she could never move past this incident. They say that she was haunted by the belief that Matthew had gotten away with something terrible. So, despite it initially sounding like an outrageous leap, it turns out that Chelsea did actually have a motive after all. Beneath the surface of their messy encounter lay a resentment that never really died. But here is the $1 million question. Could the FBI prove it? Well, as it turns out, yes, and the evidence amounts to laughable levels. On the evening of March the 5th, and at 5:46 PM, security cameras at an Ohio Turnpike toll plaza caught a glimpse of something interesting, that being a white smart car slipping through the Akron exit. Now, if you're from the area, you will know that this leads towards the Tiki Underground Bar, which is precisely where Matthew just happened to be that night. Only a few minutes later, at 6 PM, Matthew got that text message. He then turned to his co-workers, said goodbye, and stepped outside with his supervisor. The supervisor would later tell the investigators that he watched Matthew climb into a small white or silver car, which seemed to be driven by a woman with brown hair. The bar's surveillance cameras would later confirm this. And for those still wondering if this really was Chelsea, well, license plate trackers would later match the car to her husband, who, out of respect, will have his identity kept private. About 15 minutes later, and just down the road at a BP gas station, that same small white car would show up on another surveillance camera. Only a few seconds later, Matthew was seen stepping inside to buy cigarettes, a red canned drink, and a bottle of Aquafina, which, as we know, would later become crucial evidence to this case. Multiple surveillance cameras, license plate readers, and GPS data would all confirm that the two then headed north together, eventually arriving at an Airbnb located on Ashbury Avenue on the eastern side of Cleveland, Ohio. The Airbnb in question was reserved under the name of Chelsea Perkins, with a credit card under her name also being used. Not subtle at all, hey? Later that evening, a surveillance camera from a Verizon store showed the two entering a Potbelly sandwich shop together. After that, the two then headed back to their Airbnb, with nearby cell towers holding a consistent record of the two of them. The following morning, at 9:03 AM, Matthew texted his girlfriend to say, "I'm guessing you don't miss me, and I bet you're mad with me. I pissed this chick off anyway, so I hope you're happy." At 11:09 AM, he then pulled up Google Maps and typed in directions to the Terra Vista Natural Study Area, a quiet pocket of trails which are tucked away inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And by 9:45 AM, GPS data confirmed that he had arrived. Cell towers would also confirm that Chelsea was there too, with her device pinging off a cell tower at 9:59 AM. While nobody can say for sure what precisely happened between the two under that canopy of trees, what we do know is that at 10:29 AM, Matthew sent a final text message to his girlfriend, simply reading, "Okay, I'll see you in a little while." Except he wouldn't, because not long after that, Matthew vanished for good. Chelsea and Matthew may have remained in privacy visually, but only a couple of minutes later, a couple heard a gunshot echoing through the trees. Fearing for their safety, they turned around and darted towards the car park, and when they eventually got there, what do you think they saw? It was Chelsea's white smart car. Only a few minutes later, another couple who were completely unaware of the commotion arrived at the car park, and once they got out of the car and walked up the trail, they saw Chelsea near the cemetery, which, by the way, was pretty much exactly where Matthew's body was found. So now, there wasn't just 2 but 4 people that could now pin Chelsea at the exact time and place that Matthew was murdered. However, this is where it gets really interesting. Do you remember that bottle of water that Matthew bought at the gas station? Well, it turns out that he'd actually brought that with him to the cemetery, with investigators later finding it next to his body. And when they tested it, they found that it contained both Matthew's and Chelsea's DNA. And if you think that's bad enough, well, it only gets worse, because her DNA wasn't only found on that bottle, but also under his fingernails and all over his pubic hair. So, I guess you could say it's the physical evidence that really turned heads. It is also worth highlighting here that the bullet found in the back of Matthew's skull was a 9mm round, and the gun that was licensed underneath Chelsea's name was a 9mm Springfield Armory. So, what did Chelsea do after Matthew was gone? Well, the road keeps talking, and it turns out that she really did go to that tattoo parlor. Turnpike Easy Pass records show that she was traveling northbound by 1 PM. She then slipped onto the Ohio Turnpike at North Ridgeville and then headed west, straight towards Toledo. From Toledo, she then crossed state lines into Michigan, before then eventually arriving at Family Inc. And while Matthew's body lay lifeless in the park, Chelsea celebrated by getting herself a brand new tattoo, kind of like a trophy after her horrific actions. She would even talk about it on Instagram, posting a photo with the caption, "What a great weekend. I got a little blast from the babe in her sick-ass new shop. So proud." And yes, by the way, it does mean that this picture of Chelsea was taken only hours after she murdered another human. The following day, more surveillance cameras and plate checkers would track her driving all the way back home, before then carrying on with her life as if nothing had happened. But fast forward to the end of the month on March the 30th, investigators were done playing nice, and that is when they showed up at Chelsea's home in Arlington with a search warrant in hand. Thankfully, what they found inside was all they had hoped for, because hidden away in a backpack was a Springfield Armory 9mm pistol with her ID card right beside it. Forensic experts then compared the bullet pulled from Matthew's skull to rounds fired from Chelsea's handgun. and the markings left behind were so eerily similar to the fatal bullet that it was impossible to ignore. Oh, and by the way, here is something that I almost forgot to point out. But only 3 days before the murder, Chelsea jumped on Facebook and posted, "Dead men tell no tale."
Oh,
I mean, that is a little too
fuck.
on the nose if you ask me.
This chick,
And
man.
guess what? But that was actually posted on the same day that she reconnected with Matthew. So now, the police had, well, pretty much everything you'd expect in a rock-solid case.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, that being multiple witnesses, DNA, a murder weapon, and a motive far darker than most people could stomach. However, despite having all of that stacked against her, the detectives hesitated to arrest her. Maybe they were just being cautious, or maybe they wanted more time. The bottom line is, though, that for now, Chelsea walked free. And this is where our story twists and turns into a very bizarre nightmare. Matthew's mother, Tommy Lynn, was consumed by grief because, well, her son was dead. Yet, with every day that passed, she knew that his killer was out there somewhere living their best life. And so, when the police hesitated to arrest the person they believed murdered her son, Tommy Lynn flipped out, and instead she decided that she would take justice into her own hands.
Oh.
So, this is when Tommy decided to launch her own investigation instead. However, as Tommy dug deeper into her son's case, her mental health slowly began to unravel. She eventually convinced herself that it must be one of Matt's ex-girlfriends that was behind his murder. And to be fair, she was half right. But this burden of trying to uncover the truth would slowly begin to consume her. Sleepless nights turned into her new normal, and she spent countless hours poring over every scrap of evidence, chasing leads, and replaying what-ifs in her mind. The deeper she went, the more isolated she became. Friends started to drift away, and the family worried that they couldn't reach her. Her obsession with solving her son's case slowly eclipsed everything, until one day, that obsession turned into a plan far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Together
God,
and
she
with her
tried to take it
husband,
into her-
she planned an act of revenge so desperate that it barely felt real. She purchased a fake UPS uniform, loaded up the family car, and then drove all the way to Washington, D.C., to what they believed was Matthew's killer's doorstep. When Tommy knocked on that front door, her hands were trembling so violently that she could barely keep her grip on the gun, which was hidden underneath her delivery jacket. She had now made up her mind. The woman who killed her son would now have to pay in blood, and that came at the cost of 2 bullets to the stomach. But fate, or maybe just a cruel twist of tragedy, seemed to have other plans instead, because that woman who opened the front door, that was not Chelsea Perkins. Not even close. And although she may have had some faint resemblance towards Chelsea, she was a completely innocent stranger, and someone who had no connection in Matthew's death. Tommy Lynn had made a terrible mistake and had shot the wrong person.
Oh,
and now,
Jesus.
with a gun in her hand and in a stranger's hallway, her revenge came crashing down around her. Matthew's mother then fled the scene, and of course, the police were right behind her,
Oh.
but unfortunately, it was already too late. Tommy Lynn was convinced that there was no way out of this, and so she
Oh,
did
don't.
the unthinkable.
You shot him.
She grabbed her gun, raised it to her head, and then pulled the trigger. In an instant, the Dunmire family lost not just a son, but a mother too, a second life that was swallowed by the same darkness that started it all. And as for Chelsea, well, her story wasn't finished yet. Although she carried on as if nothing had happened, posting on Instagram in her skimpy outfits, and in other outfits like this, she was now on borrowed time. On December the 9th of 2021, Chelsea was finally arrested on suspicion of murder. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as she was led away in handcuffs, apparently looking just as stone-faced and silent as she did at the cemetery. Down at the station, detectives finally interviewed her. They laid out the facts, including the smart car, the gas station water bottle, the DNA found on Matthew, and the bullet that matched so perfectly. However, Chelsea decided to stick to her story and denied any involvement whatsoever. She swore that she did not kill Matthew, and that she couldn't explain her DNA which was found on his body. Many of her friends were shocked by the news. I mean, Chelsea openly hated Matthew, sure, but murder? That was a surprise. There were no major red flags, she had no criminal record and no history of violence, and hadn't been diagnosed with anything either. On paper, she did appear to be a stable person, even if that did include her double life as Selena Savage. And now that I think about it, the surname really did not work in her favour. Detectives were convinced this would be an easy open and shut case. After all, Chelsea didn't just snap in an undocumented fashion, she planned every step. She booked an Airbnb, drove more than 300 miles to meet him, and then even scheduled a tattoo appointment for after the murder. To investigators, it all pointed towards one thing: cold-blooded, premeditated murder. After being arrested, Chelsea was ultimately denied bail, meaning she had no choice but to sit in a jail cell until her trial. But before that would begin, the prosecution offered her a deal: a sentence of 27 to 31 years behind bars if she were to admit to murdering Matthew. If Chelsea had taken this offer, then she would be free again by the time she turned 65. However, she would ultimately refuse this plea deal and then stand by her own story, but only for a short while. Because eventually she had a change of heart, and on May the 27th, 2025, Chelsea Perkins pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, unfortunately excluding first degree. It's interesting, but if the court accepts this plea agreement, then she will spend 20 to 25 years behind bars, which actually is a 25% cut to the first plea deal that she rejected. Now, if I had to hazard a guess, I would probably say that Chelsea realized that the evidence was simply so strong that there was no way she would win this. So I've known about this story for probably 3 weeks now, and if I'm honest with you, every time I think about it, it just stops me dead in my tracks. From Coast Guard to OnlyFans murder, then to convicted killer. What a slide. It's just absolutely crazy. And if that wasn't enough already, throwing Tommy Lynn's revenge and then death into the mix, well, now we've got a script that even Hollywood would call a bit much. Chelsea has always maintained that the main motive was revenge, which, okay, fair enough. Maybe not to that degree, but still, fair enough. But I can't be the only one thinking this. Why did she sleep with him that night? With her DNA being found on Matthew's private region, there is no room for doubt here. The two were intimate shortly before she pulled the trigger, which boggles my mind a little bit because, well, parenthood aside, Chelsea claimed that he'd assaulted her only a few years prior. And look, I'm not here to question whether it happened or not, because quite frankly, I have no authority to do so. I do have one question for you. If that were to happen to you, would you ever in a million years sleep with that person again? It's just another twist in this story that makes it so messy and unpredictable. Regardless of what you believe, one thing is clear, that Chelsea had two lives. There was the life that she showed the world, that being a smiling face, a new tattoo, snapshots of ordinary moments and not so family-friendly moments. And then there was the darker side of her too. The side where she determined that justice would not be handed down by a judge, but taken by force on her own terms instead. To be blunt, it is quite hard to believe that she actually believed that she would get away with his death too. I mean, her plot contained not one, but several glaring holes. And I still can't wrap my head around this photo, which was taken the very day she murdered Matthew. In fact, there are dozens more photos after it, and it's kind of unsettling to realize that, even after pulling that trigger, she just seemed to carry on, smiling for selfies, posing for the camera, and living like nothing ever happened. It's moments like this that remind me that sometimes the scariest of monsters don't actually look like monsters at all. Well, maybe just a little bit. And on that note, folks, I'm going to wrap up this video here, but I genuinely want to know what you think about this one. Do you think it was revenge, or just cold-blooded murder? Or do you think it was something even more complicated? Please share your thoughts down below. Thank you so much. I think these people just do cold-blooded murder, especially if you're gonna. And if you haven't yet, please do slap that subscribe button. It really does help me out. As always, I'll see you in the next video, which will be next week now. But until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.
Oh, we finally got one. Oh, pick. Got you. Oh, they're carrier. Pine tails, eh? Got an apple. Oh, it's a drink. Yes. I think I have the foil page. Hydro. And then we got, oh man, this is a long one. Well, we'll just,
This is Anastasia Grishman, a Russian gamer, model, and tattoo artist.
actually, no, let's not. Let's save it for, alright, let's just complete the, let me, Zelf. Igoroth. Pentascorch. And oh, it's a holo. Alrin. Impact. Essicle. Harry. Magnet. Wheel. Palkia wheel. Ooh. That's the full art one. Hello. That's the one I want. That's a good one. I didn't do this one. That's so good. I'm pretty sure this is super rare one. Oh yeah, 2-star, yeah. It's not the 3-star one, but it's 2-star. Just as. That's a good. Boom. Yeah, that's a really good one. Right? You can see the difference. We need these for Terrible. Get a ancient buttermilk. Bugger. I just littered my. Special battery ball. Got a iron crown. Fair one. Oh, apparently this black crown. One of these actually. I don't know if the star rare. It might be a little bit more rare. Right. Right, ladies and gents, that is all the cool. We got a pretty decent, especially with that fucking the double star full art rate. Surprised we even got. That's just good fun. Okay. I have to. Sorted. But yeah, there you have it. That is all the cards. I'm just gonna show off. Be a dick. We got these. 1, 2. Oh, we got some okay ones. I don't know if the Magneton, the Spurking is the paid promotion. I don't know if you get a different or not. There you have it. All right, ladies and to call it because I gotta wake up early. Sorry. Not only do I have to wake up early in the morning, but yeah. I need to go grab some stuff. But yeah, anyways. That's gonna do it for tonight. I'm not gonna stream the cleanup. Anyways, there we have it.